Welcome to the latest installment of Don't Take This as Gospel. I'm Mike Partika, and we are in Dennis Prager's book, The Rational Bible, Exodus, God, Slavery, and Freedom. Pick up a copy at the affiliate link in my video description. We're in chapter 28. We're in the section where Moses is being instructed by God on how to make clothing for the high priest and the priests. Now, Dennis Prager chooses at this point to break into an essay on the importance of clothing, and in this portion he says, "Clothing is a distinctive sign of being human. It sets people apart from animals. Animals walk around unclothed. People should not." Genesis teaches the first thing God made for Adam and Eve were garments. And the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Benno Jacob makes the point that whereas God required people to invent or discover fire, agriculture, and all other aspects of culture and civilization, God himself gave them clothing. In so doing, he consecrated human beings for a holier purpose than the unclothed animals, just as Moses consecrated the priests for a holier purpose than the rest of the Israelites. The single greatest argument against public nudity may not even be about sex per se, but about holiness. Clothing distinguishes human beings from animals. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Genesis, you probably picked up on the fact that something in this passage is very wrong. It talks about this remark by Benno Jacob that God himself gave man clothing, that man did not invent clothing. Even according to the Genesis narrative, this is false. If you look at Genesis, I believe it's 3:7, Adam and Eve have just eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which they were not supposed to eat from. And one of the things that results from this is, according to Genesis 3:7, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. So what we have here is Adam and Eve, not God, making clothes for themselves out of plants. And notice also, it just says made coverings for themselves. It doesn't say that they were covering their private parts necessarily. They just knew that they were naked and wanted to hide themselves. Now, of course, in our day and age, we understand that, covering is a matter of covering the parts of the body that people have sexualized. Okay, so we have this link between sex and clothing, that we don't allow people to go around with their private parts unclothed. But that's us. When we're talking about Adam and Eve, we're talking about these innocent human beings who have suddenly sinned and now suddenly discover that they're naked. Now, why is it that they realize that they're naked at this point? Well, first of all, we need to really go into an examination of what that means. And it's funny because I watched Jordan Peterson giving his talks on the Genesis narratives. And it's it's an excellent series. You should watch that if you haven't already done that. But one of the things that he says that he's struggled with is the idea of their eyes were opened and they knew what they were naked. What did that mean? Now, Jordan Peterson comes to the conclusion that it was talking about Adam and Eve recognizing their vulnerabilities. They knew how they could be harmed and they knew how they could harm others. And so they donned this clothing to protect themselves. I don't think that could be a spin on it, but I don't really think that's the spin on it. What I would say is the reason that they knew that they were naked is that prior to that, they had nothing to hide. Now, understand that according to the Genesis story, Adam and Eve were created in a state of total innocence. They had no sin in them. They basically could relate to each other and to God as though there was nothing to hide. But once they had eaten from this tree, which God had commanded them not to eat from, then they did have something to hide. And it's kind of like something else that Jordan Peterson said. Jordan Peterson once talked about how when he's renovating a home, if there is an aspect of the home, maybe some piece or portion or section of a room or something like that, that he hasn't actually interacted with himself physically in some way, then it doesn't really feel like it's his. It doesn't feel like he really knows that. Now, just think of the sin that Adam and Eve have committed. They took something and not just interacted with it, ingested it, and made it a part of themselves. So their sin was not just, their having done something. Their sin was having taken something into themselves to become a part of them. And it was a part of them that they realized, it made them realize that they were visible. They could be seen. And this part of themselves that they never had before could also be seen, by someone who was piercing, whose gaze was piercing enough. I kind of liken it to one time I was doing something that a friend of mine had told me not to do, and I was outdoors doing that thing that I was not supposed to do with my friend's property, which was the issue, using it in a way that I was not supposed to be using it. So I'm not going to go into details, but it wasn't anything dirty. I know I'm being a little bit clandestine here, but it wasn't anything dirty and it wasn't anything illegal. So don't worry about oh my gosh, is he hinting at something? It's like, yeah, I know I shouldn't have used the shovel to bury that body, but no, it was nothing like that. But it was enough of my friend not wanting me to use the property in that fashion, that when there was a car coming around the corner with headlights on, I felt caught. I felt seen. I felt as though whoever was driving the car could see that I was doing wrong. And I think it's to that kind of sensation that the Genesis narrative is speaking. Their eyes were opened, and you could almost kind of like my deer in the headlights kind of look at that moment, like, their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked, because prior to that, look away. There's nothing worth concealing. There's nothing that I would hide. If I'm a totally innocent person, I don't mind you looking at me, because what have I done wrong? I've actually had instances of that kind of sense of blamelessness in my life, where somebody's looking at me and I'm thinking to myself, oh, maybe this person, and then I realize this person has no reason to blame me for anything, and I realize, oh, I can be completely open with this person because I haven't done anything wrong. So I know the difference between the feeling of blamelessness and the feeling of wishing I could conceal myself. Or feeling like I have to keep part of myself hidden from someone because I've done something wrong. It's that kind of distinction that's made, I believe, in this. Their eyes were open and they knew that they were naked. And so what is their response? Their natural response is to cover up. And it doesn't even really say that they're covering up their loins, as if it's a sexual thing. I still think that that's something that we're reading into the text on account of our link between clothing and sexuality. It talks about them making coverings for themselves, but what are they trying to cover up? They're trying to cover up the fact that they've sinned. They want to have that freedom to be looked at again, but they can't have it because they know that they've done this wrong thing. And so they're trying to compensate by making a covering over themselves, as if that can hide what they've done. And at this point, it's made entirely of plant material. They sewed leaves together and made a garment out of leaves. So man there is responsible for creating the clothing. What God does, though, is make clothing of skins for Adam and Eve. So the plant coverings was insufficient in some way. And we're not exactly told in some way, and I think we have to draw inference about that. Because it's not like, the clothing was necessarily not warm enough. It isn't that the clothing was, because, who knows, maybe it's summer. You don't need warm clothing in summer, so why would you need the animal skins for that reason? It's not necessarily that they did such a poor job because they sewed leaves together and the leaves were just going to fall apart. I mean, maybe it's not, the best construction material for making clothing. But there's a much deeper meaning, I think, in this, in that God had told Adam and Eve that in the day that they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they would die. Well, the Bible makes a clear distinction between plants and animals when it comes to life. Animals have the blood. Animals have the breath of life and the blood of life, and therefore there is a qualitative difference in the Bible, and it's a qualitative difference that we all recognize, between the death of a plant and the death of an animal. The death of an animal is at least somewhat akin to human death. And therefore, in a substitutional way, an animal skin can cover you and show your death in a way that plants can't. And like I said, even in the secular world, we make the distinction between plants and animals. Just look at the vegan craze. Just look at vegetarians versus omnivores and carnivores. We understand that we give no regard to plant life, but we do hold animal life in some regard, to the extent that at least we don't think that we should treat them cruelly. I mean, nobody talks about being cruel to a tree, I mean, unless it's like a sequoia or something really majestic. But otherwise, nobody talks about, plant cruelty, but we can talk about animal cruelty, because we recognize that animals have lives. They don't have the same, equivalent lives to human beings, not unless you're a PETA nut, but they do have lives that we ought to give at least some measure of respect and dignity. So when we're talking about what does it take to truly cover your sin, it takes an animal sacrifice and not a plant sacrifice. And it is a sacrifice, by the way. It's not a word that's specifically used in Genesis, and so I think that gets missed. I think I missed it for many, many years. But it's very important to understand that in order for God to make clothings of skins for Adam and Eve, he had to sacrifice animals. There's no way around it. It's not like you could have a living animal that you skinned in order to make the clothing for Adam and Eve. That's just not how it works. So God made a sacrifice for Adam and Eve and clothed them in that sacrifice to make atonement for them. So why do we wear clothing? You can say that clothing dignifies, but it dignifies because it covers. And it covers because we look at one another, and I think that to a large degree we don't particularly like what we see. When you're unclothed, when you're naked before someone, they can see you warts and all. So if you have blemishes, if you have just impurities in your skin, if you have your outward appearance for some reason, if you got a small Johnson or something like that, you have things to be you have things to be self-conscious about. You have these flaws externally that you would rather people not see. And so It's not so much that the dignity comes from having the clothing, the dignity comes from hiding the portions of you that you don't want to see. And so, in that way, I don't know where Dennis Prager's really going or what basis he really has for making this idea that, clothing is a sort of consecration. Now, I do think that in the case of like a high priest or something like that, there is a consecrational function of clothing that can be bestowed by clothing, but just the notion of having clothing altogether as being a consecrating thing, I think is kind of off base. I think it is much more appropriate to the biblical narrative to say that clothing is a symbol of the fact that we, as fallen human beings, as opposed to animals who have no sense of guilt or shame, understand that we have something to hide, that we have portions of ourselves that we're not proud of. We have things in us that we'd rather people not know about us. And it is because of that feeling like we don't want to be seen that nudity is an expression of intimacy. It is an expression of I'm not holding anything back from you. So there you have it. That's my little discourse on the importance of clothing. What is the significance and all that? So, please do subscribe if you haven't already. That way you can be notified when the next installment of one of my videos comes out. And I will catch you later. Again, I'm Mike Bartica. This is Don't Take This as Gospel, and I will see you next time.